Greetings to you and happy Easter if you're viewing this at the time for which it is intended. Of course, you may be seeing it at any time at all. But happy Easter if that does apply. We're looking in this session and in the next one at the first part of the Easter story in Luke's Gospel. That is Luke 24, 1 to 12. The last few sessions we've looked at quite big chunks, the 20, 30 verses. Today we're looking at 12 verses as the first of two parts. It's sometimes an overview, sometimes a more detailed view. In this session, I want to just take you through the story fairly conventionally of what happened in the morning on that first Easter day. And next time to think through, from the same 12 verses, some of the implications and go a little bit deeper, as I think this chapter and Luke's Gospel encourage us to do. Most of Luke 24 is simply occupying one day. That's quite remarkable. The Easter and post-Easter appearances of Jesus occupy several weeks, and in Matthew and in John, you've got quite a bit of that. Here, he just focuses on what happens on that first day, and that's quite significant too. Luke 24, 1 to 12. I'm going to read the whole thing. In fact, I'm going to begin at verse 55 of chapter 23 because it just picks up the story. Don't think this is a new chunk of the Bible. It's very much a continuation of the story, and it's meant to be that way. So Luke 23, 55 onwards, I shall read. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week at early dawn they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. When they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. It's about the women. Luke doesn't identify them immediately. We have them mentioned earlier on a couple of times, the women who were with him from Galilee, who travelled with him, who supported him in his ministry. There's a list of some of them earlier on in the Gospel, but during the Passion narrative, the story of his sufferings and his death, they're just mentioned from time to time, the women who had come with him from Galilee. Luke doesn't tell us who they are till after they've encountered the empty tomb. But what he says agrees with all three of the other Gospels. It's a group of women, but the first named in each of the Gospels is Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdala. Magdala, a fishing village and thriving market town on the uh, northwestern shore of Lake Galilee, not so far from Capernaum and other places where Jesus ministered a great deal. Mary, from whom Jesus had driven out evil spirits. Mary, who'd followed him faithfully. There's stuff in church history that describes Mary as having been a prostitute. There's nothing about that in the Bible. Clearly a very troubled woman before Jesus met her and exorcised or healed her, but nothing about an immoral life other than in some bits of church history, possibly confusing her with one or two of the others Jesus met during his Galilee ministry. Mary Magdalene, presumably reasonably prosperous, because these were a group of women who travelled with Jesus, seemed to have been well off and supported him and the disciples in various ways on their travels. Others are named. Mary, the mother of James, is regularly mentioned in this list. But others vary a bit from one gospel to the other, but it's and other women, a group of them, but Mary Magdalene seen as the key one and the leader. And of course, that's important, her role as the first witness of the resurrection. And by witness, we don't just mean someone who saw it, but someone who declared it, someone who told the apostles, the 11. They come to the tomb early dawn, taking the spices they had prepared. The spices and ointments weren't embalming, they were sweet smelling, strong smelling ointments simply to reduce or stop the smell of a body going off in the heat. But it was a mark of respect and love to the dead person that family members or close friends would anoint the body with spices and oils as soon after burial as possible, or at burial time. But obviously they'd rushed to get Jesus buried before the Sabbath began at sunset on that Friday, and the women had to wait till the Sunday morning, the first day of the working week in ancient Israel and in modern Israel. They get to the tomb and found the stone rolled away from the tomb. A little description of the tomb helps because they went in and didn't find the body. And in verse 55 of the previous chapter, they had seen the tomb and how the body was laid. We'll know the big stone rolled across the front of the tomb. That was a fairly regular way of burial for those who were better off. If they could have a tomb in a cave or cut into the rock face. There's a lot of rocky areas in Jerusalem and a lot of places where this could be done, and some which have been found archaeologically. There's a site in Jerusalem called the Garden Tomb, where they welcome tourists, pilgrims, and visitors at a charge. It's owned slightly unusually for the Holy Land sites by an American group of Christians. It is not the place where Jesus was buried, but it's a very good picture of it. So they tell you it isn't. It's actually archaeologically dated 100 or more years before Jesus' burial, but it's a very authentic place because it shows you exactly how these tombs worked. And there were plenty of them. There is a hole, a doorway-shaped hole in the rock. Well, there are several of them, but one in particular they take you to. And you walk in and you can stand upright in it, just about. It's not high, but you can. And it goes back a little distance, the size of a small room. And in this particular one, but it will vary, of course, the wall is on your left pretty much as you go in, and the room is ahead of you and to the right. It doesn't extend very far, but at the far wall there is a platform. That is, the stone has been carved with the last part of it not carved out as far. So it's a platform. It's like a bench, but solid stone underneath it, and it's the size you can lay a body on. It's the size of a bed. And that is where the body would be. And just in front of that, a step or two down from where you go in, under a lower area. And that lower area is where people would stand who were attending to the body. It's a good size to stand. It's a step down from where you go into the tomb, but it means you're standing at a height where it's comfortable to lay the body down and indeed to anoint it and make sure it's placed as you want it to be, and so on. So the women would go into this tomb and down a step into the area, a little gully, just before the platform on which the body was laid. It wasn't buried or covered with soil or anything like that. It was wrapped in cloth and laid on that platform. But they had seen that. They knew how that worked. They'd seen the body and they'd seen the layout at the tomb and how the body was laid. And in front of the tomb, in front of the doorway, is a little groove in the ground through which a large disc-like stone it can roll. It's not a huge spherical boulder as you get on some pictures. These were cut stone, but a huge disc, taller than a doorway, and obviously circular, but relatively flattened. So it could roll in a groove on the floor to cover the door of the tomb. Not roll easily. You needed to be strong to move it, and it could be sealed with sealing wax and in other ways, as we're told in other Gospels happened. The women would have needed help probably to move that stone. They're big stones, and even though it's in a groove, it would take two or three strong men to push, or a number of strong women to push and get that stone moved. But they found the stone rolled away. It sounds as if it's easy, it isn't. And when they went in, they didn't find the body. And a number of the ancient manuscripts say the body of the Lord Jesus, but not quite all of them. So some Bible versions miss out of the Lord Jesus. May have been added later. The Lord Jesus was a title that is regularly used in Acts, and I suspect Luke did include it. It wasn't a title by which he was known at all before the resurrection. But Luke, as St. Paul, is quite keen on telling us in Acts that his resurrection declares him to be Lord. And I think they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus is Luke, but it's questioned because it's in some of the ancient manuscripts, not others. Some think it was added later. Some think it was missed out by mistake or for other reasons. But we know whose body they're talking about. They didn't find it. They were perplexed, and two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. I think the dazzling clothes are probably meant to take you back to the Transfiguration story, where Jesus appeared with two great historical figures in clothes shining brightly. It's a picture in Luke's language and in elsewhere in the New Testament too of God's presence. It's a picture of the glory of God. Uh, Angels appear that way, not in the New Testament with great wings or anything like that, but as people, usually as men, but sometimes with dazzling bright clothes. It's something supernatural. The women, terrified, bow their faces to the ground. Well, it's a bit much, isn't it? Empty tomb, and uh, these two men in dazzling clothes. But the message from the men is important. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. The empty tomb matters because it's empty. But in one sense, it doesn't matter because he isn't there. He is alive. What matters is to meet the living Christ. And to know he was in the tomb and he died, but to know that he's alive and that he is risen. That really matters. Sometimes there can be an emphasis for any of us on getting the history and the detail and was the tomb really empty and how did the tomb work and all the stuff I've just been telling you. And there's always a queue and lots of people at the empty tomb in the garden just outside Jerusalem. Always a crowd of people, and there's a crowd of people at another place where he's more likely to have been buried, um, which is now has a big church built round it in what's now in Jerusalem, but it would have been just outside the city walls in Jesus' day. Whichever of the sites, well, the Garden Tomb, as it's known, doesn't claim to be the site, though it claims to be a very good replica. Another site very similar, which is still in good condition. He wasn't buried in the Garden Tomb. He may well have been buried in the site that is also revered. And I confess I've been to both and I've taken groups to both sites. Um, there can be an overemphasis, though, on the tomb. All sorts of religious services and stuff go on in and near and round both of these sites in Jerusalem. And sometimes I suspect the emphasis isn't quite on the fact that Jesus isn't there, that he's risen. I think it helps historically to know what the tomb was like and that it was empty. That is really important. But to focus on that rather than focusing on he's alive is a little bit of a mistake. Anyway, the angels tell them he's not here, he's risen. Remember, he told you that this would happen. And then they remembered. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to the rest, a wider group of Jesus followers, uh, numbered for us early on in Acts, around 120 followers at that point. And when they told the 11 and the others, these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. They didn't report this. In Luke's gospel, each of the gospels tells the same story from a slightly different perspective. In this gospel, they just go back and tell the 11 and the others that the tomb is empty. Uh, Luke doesn't tell us or emphasize, and possibly didn't know when he wrote this, that Mary Magdalene had an encounter with Jesus outside the tomb, as we read in John chapter 20. But he knew that Mary Magdalene was the leader of this little gang, and she gets mentioned first. But whether you read it in Luke or in John, uh, the result is the same. The 11 didn't believe them. I think Luke's making a big point here, and we'll look more at that next time. But it doesn't quite say whether the women believed or not, but they knew the tomb was empty, and they heard the words of the angels, and they remembered what Jesus had taught. And so they go and tell the men, and it's an idle tale as far as the men are concerned. Those of us who try to talk about Jesus' resurrection still are often treated as if it's an idle tale. And Christians who believe in the resurrection, as these women seem to have done at that point, simply because they've been told it's true and possibly explained about the empty tomb, are very often and easily criticized for being credulous, believing any old fairy story, an idle tale. And the men didn't believe them. There are some theologians who make quite a lot of the fact that the women were more ready to believe than the men. And some compliment the women on that, and some don't. And you can take your choice with a lot of these things. But the men didn't believe on the basis of what they were told. They wouldn't believe until they saw. Thomas doubly so, but the same was true for the others. But we're told Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Now, there's more detail elsewhere. John went with him, but that isn't part of Luke's purpose in telling the story. Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. And that amazement is important too. That's not the amazement of belief at all. That's just perplexity. It's quite an unusual word in the New Testament. You've got it here and you've got it in Acts, but nowhere else, I don't think. He's seriously perplexed, as are the women in verse 4 when they don't find the body. It's a bit mind-boggling and disturbing. Now, that's the story on its own. That's all we get on Easter morning in Luke's Gospel. There's a lot more to come, because the story of the road to Emmaus is later that day, and we'll come to that in 2 sessions, perhaps 2 weeks' time. And then another encounter with the 11, and a wider group perhaps than the 11, towards the end of the chapter, where they meet the risen Jesus. So all that is still to come, and it's all on this same Easter day. But spend time in this session just focusing on the empty tomb and the reality of that, and then remember that although the empty tomb is important historically, Jesus wasn't still lying there. His bones aren't still in Galilee or in the Holy Land, as some would say. He really did rise from the dead. But the importance isn't that the tomb is empty. The importance is that Jesus is alive. He is risen. He's not just alive in their memories in some vague, wishy-washy spiritual way. As we'll see later in the chapter, he's alive, very much flesh and bones, and able to eat fish with them. That will all come later on. Jesus is alive. And the women hear the message, and the extent to which they believe or understand isn't clear and isn't explained and doesn't need to be. They've seen the tomb is empty. They've been reminded that Jesus said that was what would happen. He would suffer and be put to death and rise again. And they've gone to tell the 11. They've been faithful witnesses, even without fully understanding. And that's a valid thing and thing that Christians sometimes need to do. Sometimes any of us, me included, just want everything explained and want to understand everything all the time fully. And as Thomas says in John, I won't believe unless I see. There are others who will say, I won't believe unless I understand. Well, the women were wiser than that, I suspect. Here's perplexity. Here is, as later theologians would say, great mystery. There's something here we don't fully understand. Rising from the dead. We can have resuscitation nowadays for someone whose heart has stopped. That isn't the same as rising from the dead in the way that Jesus did. Rising from the dead, never to die again, with a transformed body that is both recognizable and different. That is just way outside our experience. It's something we don't understand, but with the women we can believe it. We can talk about it. We can even rejoice in it. We're not told that they even rejoiced in it at that point, but they returned from the tomb and told it. They couldn't help talking about it, even though the men didn't believe them. And I suspect they would have known on the way that they wouldn't be believed, but they were going to tell the story. And telling the story is important. And that's what goes on here. But with a degree of amazement all round. The women are perplexed. Peter is amazed when he goes to look. It's still not fully believing in the sense of understanding rather more than they did. But for the women, I think being reminded of Jesus' words, yeah, it fits. It is what he said. We'll go and tell. We'll go and tell. And that's a very good start on Easter morning. See you next time. God bless.